Tell us when you're ready to start, Bill.
Anytime. The tape's still running.
Okay.
Tape's rolling.
Could you tell us, please, about the canal?
Well, Nixon decided to cancel the Cross Florida Barge Canal, which was a canal that went from Jacksonville across to the Gulf Coast and therefore enhanced the economics of the town of Jacksonville a great deal. And we called a press conference and publicly said, we're not going to build a canal. Well, this, of course, infuriated the people in Jacksonville, but we knew nothing about this at the time. That weekend, Nixon was with Bebe Rebozo on his houseboat down there, and obviously, and then the next Monday, John Ehrlichman calls me and says, the president's changed his mind. Maybe he's not going to cancel the canal. The canal may stay in being. And I said, well, how can we do that, John? We've had a press conference. We're going to announce it. And like any presidential aide who thinks he's doing a good job, when he hears a bad decision like that, he just does nothing for a while and hopes it'll go away. A couple of weeks later, John and I are on a helicopter going out to Andrews with the president or something, and the president kind of looks at me with this baleful look in his eye and says, how's that canal you canceled doing? It was my canal now, not his. So anyway, John and I reconstructed and said, well, probably what's happened is the bankers in Jacksonville were so angry that the canal was going to be canceled that they talked Bebe into it, and then Bebe talked the president and made the president unsure of his decision. So that's the way things stood. And I pulled out these statistics to show in the polls that Nixon had made a wonderful decision, how popular it was to close the canal. He'd gotten more letters in favor of it than he'd gotten letters against his invasion of Cambodia. It was politically a great success for him. So he listened to me and his head nods, and he was politically adding this up in his head, you know, and he looked out the window of the helicopter, and then he looked back at John and me, and he said, too bad, isn't it? Jacksonville was a great town. Okay.
Do we want to continue now or take a break?
Well,
Or?
let's take a break. You wanted to take a break, right?
I think we'll beat it then.
That's great. And
Okay. Right.
That was.
Did I get it right at that time?
Yeah, not recently. That's.
Take roll.
Well, we were discussing the water pollution debate, Nixon's veto, and then the override that followed it. In that bit of legislation, it said that the administration was not to exceed $18 billion in spending on waste treatment centers, and Nixon took that to mean that he did not have to spend that much money. It was just not to exceed, and therefore he refused to spend that money, believing it was a budget breaker, and this became known as, and he's impounded the funds. This led to litigation and a whole big controversy. Eventually, after the courts had ruled against the administration, there was a compromise reached that resulted in the creation of the Congressional Budget Office. What do you recall of the whole impoundment debate? And do you believe that Nixon was correct or wise to do as he did?
Well, the courts proved that he wasn't wise in the end. That's all I can remember about it, to tell you the truth, although he really viscerally spent, and we gave him all kinds of evidence that they couldn't spend that much money if they tried. And it turned out historically that was the case. And but he probably thwarted the will of Congress and Congress's right to set spending limits, and that's what the court decided. That's kind of all I remember about it, though, to tell you the truth.
In a related issue, there was a water quality agreement with Canada over the Great Lakes, and this involved phosphates, which were used in detergents and put out in the Great Lakes, said lead to eutrophication and kill the lakes. There was some debate over a substitute, NTA. I couldn't tell you the full name of that. But what do you recall of that debate? And how about the interaction between the United States and Canada in that regard?
Well, I probably did some pretty bad staff work on that deal. There was this growing feeling that phosphates, mainly detergents, which you could get from soap. Procter & Gamble was in to see us a lot. Wouldn't work. So they came up with a substitute called NTA. But Procter & Gamble kept saying, I don't know if it was Procter & Gamble, the soap industry in general, Levy, Procter & Gamble was saying, but this stuff hasn't been tested yet. It hasn't been tested well enough yet to see if it has any problems like cancer or something like that. And Jesse Steinfeld was the Surgeon General at the time. Jesse's testing all his mice over there all the time. So we go ahead publicly and say we're for NTA, and we start putting it in the system and all that. And one day Jesse calls me and tells me his mice are sick. You know, they're dying of cancer. So we had to retrench from this thing. And we eventually went back to using phosphates, although they were probably a environmentally more benign phosphate, but still. But I can remember, to show you how polarized things went, I was in a meeting with the chairman of the board of, the president of Procter & Gamble, and the chairman of the board, who was then an elderly man named Neil McElroy. And Neil McElroy was the Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower, and he was a well-known, kind of very prominent industrialist. And he looked at me and he said, is the president really going to ban phosphate? You're going to recommend to him that he bans phosphate? And I said, yes, sir, I think I am. And I called him Mr. Secretary. He turned to the president and says, isn't it amazing that Dick would hire young communists like this to be on his staff? He's talking about me. Yeah. So we had a long way to go with Procter & Gamble at that point.
He said this in front of the president.
Said this in front of, no, to me. He said this to the, no, the president of the company, not the president. No, not the president. He wasn't in the meeting. Thank God.
A young communist.
Great quote.
Most of the development on the Great Lakes was on the American side. And
so the treaty had an unfair
right.
sense
So I
of
mean,
that.
I was wondering, what was you aware of any friction between internationally? Did Henry Kissinger or anybody in the White House?
No,
and
Train
foreign
handled
policy?
that. That was Russ's initiative, and he handled that as far as I know. He might have had some problems with state. There was an assistant secretary, but for environment in those days. But his name was Chris Herter, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yes.
This is the son of the guy who was
Right.
Secretary of State back in Eisenhower's time, I think. But I don't remember any problems, even though there was definitely a difference. So we had to do a lot more cleaning up than the Canadians had to do.
Right.
They had to do
Right.
some. I mean, we had a lot more industrial effluent going into the lakes. But I do remember being in Ottawa at the World's Fair they had up there in Canada. I forgot what they called it. And Trudeau and Nixon both spoke and seemed to get along fine. And that was they both, as I recall, mentioned this subject and embraced it. So I don't remember it being that controversial.
To follow up on this international environmentalism, Russell Train and CEQ seem to take the lead in international environmental affairs.
Right.
Russell Train says that was by an agreement with he and William Ruckelshaus. There was the 1972 United Nations Conference on the Environment held in Stockholm, Sweden. What, if anything, do you recall of international efforts to improve the environment? And to follow up on that, specifically environmental exchanges with the Soviet Union?
Oh, well, I don't recall a lot. I was at the UN conference in Stockholm. We had a delegation there. That's when Ruckelshaus announced the cancellation of DDT for the Nixon administration. I had a funny experience there that was very embarrassing. I won't mention the person's name, but he was a big contributor to Nixon's campaign, and he was invited to come to Stockholm. And he shows up in the library of in the foyer of the Grand Hotel, and I happened to be at the moment, and he had his big suitcase with him, and I happened to be at the moment talking with the Chinese ambassador to this conference with an interpreter, and he's dressed in his usual Mao costume, you know. So this fat cat guy, Nixon's contributor, comes in, he sees me, and he walks over to me, and he starts to hand his bag to the Chinese ambassador, figuring he is the bellboy. I fortunately grabbed it just in time. That was probably my greatest contribution to the Stockholm conference.
Russell Train tells a story at Stockholm of Ehrlichman coming over and when meeting with the American delegation being quite upset because he didn't have a car and driver, and some of the other members of the delegation apparently did, and chewed out
Chewed out Russ?
chewed out, I think it was Christian Herter that took the
Yeah.
blame for it, but he was quite upset, and Russell Train claims that was what struck him about remember this whole Stockholm was the fact that Ehrlichman flew all the way over there, and his number one concern seemed to be the fact that he needed a car and driver. Do you recall that exchange?
No, I don't. And I remember John being there, but I don't remember anything about the car. I mean, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I just don't know anything about it. I remember.
Shirley
What is
Temple
Shirley was
with
there,
Black,
yeah.
right, was
Yeah.
and everybody, quote unquote, Russell Train wanted to meet her. Did she have any interaction with Nixon on that? I mean, she was somewhat interested in the environment, and she's
Well,
famous.
she was there. Yeah, that's how I first met her. Was she was she on CEQ staff at that point?
She was I don't know if you call it a consultant, but
Yeah.
she was
She was there. I remember.
right,
that.
and she was, I don't say passed around, but they were using her as to draw attention to the environment, and she knew that and was letting herself. She was
Do
speaking
that,
out
yeah.
on the environment, and the cameras would follow her, and so she had a very useful purpose in that
Right,
regard, and
right.
she was aware of it.
Right.
I didn't know if Nixon was aware of her or had her conversations with the environment. in that
I'll
regard.
tell a little story there. It's a bit out of school. It was time for a new member of the Council of Environmental Quality, and Nixon said, "You should get a woman." So I thought a bit about it, and I either sent a memo in or somehow I got the word to him that Shirley Temple might be a good person. I said, she's good on the talk show. She knows something about the environment now. She'll be, right. Get back, no. Keep looking. So I keep trying, and I'm going along, and I'm trying to get all these other people nowhere, and I get another memo into him. I said, you really ought to go with Shirley Temple. Next thing I get is a phone call from John Ehrlichman, who says, tell Whitaker, how about Bette Davis? That's all the message was. That was his way of saying, no, hell no. I don't, and I think I've told Shirley this story, so it's not so bad, but anyway. But and she would have been a good choice. She went on to be an ambassador to
Right.
Czechoslovakia, Ghana, and United Nations. She did a lot of very good, substantial work.
I remember Russ was telling me the story of he'd get a phone call saying, "Can I borrow Shirley Temple for a minute?" And because they wanted the cameras.
Yeah.
Sort of connected to that international. You mentioned the SST,
Yeah.
which is problems supersonic transport. His problems was noise,
Right.
among other issues. And Nixon appears to be very ardently a supporter of continued construction of that, primarily because the Soviets were developing it, and it seems to be Nixon, a favorite of Nixon because of the international implications.
Right. Correct.
Could you comment on that?
Well, I do remember him saying things like, one of the few of America's losing its leadership in industry, in the aircraft industry. Boeing, Lockheed Martin are two of the great things. We got to keep those. I don't remember if the Airbus was in business then or not, the European Airbus.
I don't believe that was a little bit later.
Yeah, but anyway, he saw the SST as something that, like the 727 had originally been an Air Force model, and this could eventually be the technology that was needed to bring this to supersonic commercial aircraft. So he was for it, in spite of the environmental concerns of it, which incidentally I think were overrated. But anyway, the only thing I really remember about, he asked me to see Colonel Lindbergh, see what he thought about it, and I did spend about a half hour right in the White House with him, talking to him about it. And it was quite a thing for me because he was my boyhood hero, like John Glenn would be for your generation maybe, and he was really a hero, And I remember I remember saying something to Nixon about, well, I don't know if you should get advice from him because he's on the board of Pan Am, there'd be a conflict of interest there, because Pan Am would be looking the beneficiary in those days of a commercial aircraft like that. Go ahead and see him anyway. So I did. And all I can remember is that he was very much against it, and his reason, I thought, was quite pernicious, because he was talking about fuel. The thing was not fuel economic, and this is way before the Arab embargo. Jet fuel was dirt cheap, and he still said this plane is not going to make it commercially. And Nixon, I sent a memo in, but he went ahead with it, sent it to Congress, but it never became law. That was the end of it.
There was an exchange between he and Russell Train Nixon. That is, Nixon was saying that he only proposed prototypes, and the prototypes would not cause any environmental damage, and this was simply drummed up by the environmentalists. It seemed to be an issue with Nixon that played close to his heart and annoyed him particularly. Would you say that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, probably. I don't think that Nixon felt it was the noise. When you say the prototype, he was really saying we're only going to build a few planes,
right,
so it's not going to be
a few planes,
a mass of these SSTs flying
right,
around.
Right.
But the document, because I dealt with Gordon MacDonald on this question of stripping the ozone, the atmosphere, and I didn't think, and I had other physicists I could talk to in the government would argue with Gordon that this was really a problem. I mean, the obvious problem was we had all kinds of Air Force fighters flying around supersonic at that time, and if it was stripping the ozone, it just didn't seem to be the case. As far as noise, well, it was pretty noisy. I've heard it take off. That's all I can say about it. It was visceral with Nixon. It was an international foreign trade issue with him.
There was
not an aviation alone issue.
A couple of emails listened to me. That dates me right there. But a couple of memos were taught from Nixon that this was environmentalists are driving me crazy on the SST. That it was, he would write a daily news summary, and he'd get from Patrick Buchanan. He'd write in the morning, and then he'd make comments. And the SST drew out some particularly upset comments about that.
So we all used to get that same memo back the next day, which is not a bad way to communicate with the president, by the way, to figure out what's going on in his mind, because he sees this. Buchanan would do the main stories every day, and the paper would reduce every story to whatever it was to one paragraph, and Nixon would react and scribble all over these things, and you'd get copies of them within 24 hours, so at least you know what he was thinking about, what was twigging him in those memos in the daily news.
Really helps them research standpoint as well. There were a number of environmental agreements with the Soviet Union, and it's been suggested that Nixon took a particular interest in this as the environment, not as part of his policy of détente. Do you believe that this was an integral part of Nixon's policy of détente, an environmental overture to the Soviet Union, working with the Soviets on the environmental issue, could have broader implications for policy?
Yes, but they were never spelled out. Russ handled that. Russ made the trips to Russia, and I remember being in a meeting with Russ, was reporting back to the president on his visit there. But Russ was talking about how Lake Baykal's been cleaned up, and even though they have a paper mill on it, they're cleaning it up, and he'd go on and on about that. And Nixon was like there were two people in another room, because Nixon would be talking about things about the Moscow subway and how environmentally good it is, and Brezhnev's Camp David and how nice it was, and maybe we ought to find another place that's better than just sending them down to where I forgot where Heads of State used to go, down to Williamsburg, didn't they, before they come? It was like they were talking about two different subjects while this was going on. But he was interested because Nixon was interested because I think your conclusion is correct, that he saw that certainly an environmental agreement with Russia was different than an environmental agreement with Luxembourg.
Right.
It was going to be it.
Did Henry Kissinger ever express any concern or interest in the environment?
I don't recall it, but they ever had anything to do with it much. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of it right now. Sorry.
Okay. No, in 1970 was in the wake of the Earth Day and sort of the zenith of public environmentalism.
Right.
Could you comment on the role of environment in the off-year congressional elections of 1970 and subsequently the environment in the 1972 re-election campaign?
No, I can't recall. I mean, there were probably speeches made that dealt with it and statements made about it, but I don't recall it. Probably in 70, it was more of it. In 70, the off year, that was off year. It would be more than 72 because it was, again, almost getting below the radar screen for reasons we've discussed, you know, the Social Security analogy. But I don't recall. Maybe you can enhance my memory on that.
Well, I was curious about whether the environment was ever framed in terms of an appeal to youth politically, insofar as analogy to like the 18-year vote, you know, 18-year-olds voting, and you know whether it was ever framed that way as.
Well, we had a the younger White House staff went out and did a lot of talking with youth groups. For example, Chris DeMuth, 20 years younger than I was, he was selected and not me to do that, which made sense. But I don't remember it being tied specifically to the environment issue, which is youth in general, maybe tied to the 18-year-old vote, which he signed that, yeah.
As the 1972 election approached, there's some memos suggesting that Nixon saw the environment, and I quote the memos, as wide but not deep. In other words, people cared but would vote on other issues. If you poll somebody and ask them, do you care about the environment, you get 90% or whatever saying yes. But when it comes to casting their ballot, they would vote on other issues. Do you believe that assumption is true?
I don't know to this day. I had, short of warfare with Nixon, of memos sending in to him saying that this was an issue that was more important politically than he thought it was. And he never changed his mind, and I never changed mine. So let's put it that way. And John Ehrlichman felt the same way I did. It was an issue that you better do something about. And he did something about it. But then his attitude, I've done something about it, next. Like it's off my radar screen now.
Of course, the 1972 election was just after peace is at hand in Vietnam was announced, somewhat
bigger.
Prematurely.
Right.
But is it fair, in your view, to say that the environment was overshadowed in that election?
Yes, I think so, definitely. And I don't think, as I said, I don't think we made any attempt to make it a big-time issue in the election. It wasn't part of his stump speech that I recall, anyway.
But there was a campaign film, Change Without Chaos. It was produced for the 1972 convention that features clean air and clean water.
That's right. Now I remember that.
Has some of
So
the
maybe I'm
key-
wrong in that.
Well, I
yes.
don't know.
Yeah.
It's an interesting film, and I wondered the extent to which
I remember that film now. You mentioned it. I'd forgotten all about it. Yeah, that was staged. That was a good part of that film at the convention in Miami. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
Isn't it? Yes.
David Wolper? Is that the Wolper film?
and it just seemed
Could
from
be.
the film, which
Yeah.
we have, that
Some
people thought
Some people thought, yeah.
that you should highlight the administration's environmental record.
Well, then, then he probably okayed it, but I can tell you viscerally, it wasn't up front in his mind at that point, like some of these other issues.
Well, maybe it goes back to Brooks's point about it being wide but not deep. Provided it was kind of a gloss on the campaign. Provided it was low cost and wasn't fiscally expensive.
There are a lot of memos in Russell Train's papers on Russ pushing the issue in 1972 election, and a lot of response as not to repudiate the environment, but it would not pay a large political dividends. And by that point,
That's what he believed.
right, Russ was
Yeah.
pushing this, and his
right.
response he was getting back was it would not pay political dividends, and it might alienate our natural conservative constituency. I wonder if, do you believe that the environment is a strong political issue in general? or do you think that it will always be overshadowed by the issue du jour?
Well, I think it becomes an issue when the party in power is perceived as abusing it or not going along with it. Just like if something changed, as I said, on Social Security now, but it's kind of down there, but it has the ability to pop right up and be helpful or hurt. I think more to hurt than to help. Each president always has a group of environmental messages, and they're in the press for a few days, and they kind of fade away, and you don't hear much about them. But if if the president gets up and says, "Oh, we ought to, slow down the auto mileage, or do something like that, or do something that's environmentally anathema," I think it'll spike.
To what extent do you think by 1972 there was much more organized pushback? When you think about how federal government takes a leading role in environmental policy in the Nixon administration, it's something new, as you described it. There weren't even statistics, government statistics to help you set some of these new goals. To what extent was the opposition also disorganized? And to what extent do you have an organized opposition in 1972 that's making it harder for the federal government to take the lead in environmental policy? I mean, is there some kind of development or process that's going on of that nature at that point?
Well, it could be, but I don't know. You see, Nixon always felt that what you'd call the real active environmentalists were not going to vote for him, no matter how clean his air was, or no matter how clean. They had the other issues with. I mean, everything. Vietnam dominated everything, like Iraq today. So it's hard for me to visualize what that organized. The opposition I saw. That's why I said I got the Audubon and the left and right wing to try to measure this. But I think most of the activist people were people who I agree with Nixon. They were not going to vote for him anyway. And my argument back to him was, yes, but there's lots of Garden Club moderate Republicans that this issue could be important to, and you really should keep talking about it, pay attention to it. He never bought that argument.
So then why did he do it?
Oh, because when he did the 37-point message, it was a hurricane. I'm talking about after that, which we've been discussing a lot, how the issue kind of went from here and then came subsurface and occasionally spikes. That's why he did it when he did it to begin with. I mean, everybody was screaming to do something. Congress, and we were, and the public was. It was just going crazy in the polls. And why to this day? Still
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so once the hurricane passes, which is sort of unusual,
Yes,
political moment,
that's right.
his sense was that the environment was not a winning issue for him.
That's or not worth talking about anyway, or it wasn't going to get me any votes. I've done a good thing. I can rely on what I've done. Let's just move on to something else. It's not that big a deal. That's what I think he felt.
So
I did, and I said memo after memo to him saying I didn't agree with that. You've probably seen some of those.
So the big push behind Earth Day, though, he figured that was just a spasm that didn't have any lasting, or it was a constituency that wouldn't vote for him anyway.
Well, he was wrong. It lasted for quite a while longer. It's pretty well faded now. Earth Day is hardly makes a celebration.
It's funny, Russ commented about Earth Day is that the irony of Earth Day today is to the extent that it's played up, it has corporate sponsors who are trying to scrub their own image, but it's the Earth Day, it's like Chevron Earth Day.
Yeah, that's right.
Nowadays.
You get a lot of that.
Was Earth Day a grassroots product, phenomenon?
I think it was. I mean, the original Earth Day was, I think Gaylord Nelson, the senator from Wisconsin, didn't he?
A lot of environmentalists will challenge you on that.
Is that right?
Dennis Hayes. Was working with the teach-in was the anti-war movement, and it started locally in places like San Francisco. They approached the office of Gaylord Nelson, who then became a sponsor was Michael McCloskey, and they wanted to get bipartisan sponsorship on that.
Right.
But they worked through at his office, and
Did Gaylord Nelson reach out to the federal government for some?
Oh, he was kind of like Muskie. He was no, they weren't actually. I don't remember the senators are calling or asking us to do something about it, but the lobbyists for sure that I talked to were saying, "My God, you better do something about on Earth Day," you know. And Nixon wouldn't.
The 1972 election, we were discussing that and how the environment could hurt you, as it were. In spite of Nixon's record, there's a New York Times reported that the Council of Environmental Quality, who issues an annual report, had a section on land use that was deleted. And there was a big controversy that politics had trumped what was environmentally wise in this. Do you recall this incident? And it was sort of a black eye in the election.
But I was over at Interior when I described that thing. When I got the phone call that Nixon had changed his position, I got that call from Kent Cole, who succeeded Ehrlichman as head of the Domestic Council. But I don't remember taking something out of a CEQ. It could have been. I just don't.
There was the draft submitted to CEQ for approval, and it was the sections on land use were eliminated because we talked about the land use issue was because the conservatives were upset about that.
Right.
And that was
Well, I think that's probably true because he right there in the cabinet meeting that I wasn't
and
present
that was
at.
leaked and to the New York Times. The New York Times then played it.
Right.
Such that here we are, politicians, the environmental community, the CEQ recommends this, and the politicians are taking it out. I didn't know if you recalled any of that.
No, I don't. I can't say I do.
What was your, speaking of follow-up on land use, what was your opinion of Wayne Aspinall and the Public Land Law Review Commission?
Well, it was a very Western-oriented thing. It had to do with Nixon gave it a blessing. He did a rose garden. One of these rose garden ceremonies for Congressman Aspinall, but I don't recall it had much of an impact, to tell you the truth. It was kind of an early, it had an impact in the sense it was an early discussion of land use, but it really defended the Western culture kind of. It was very much of a Western culture sort of thing that was kind of in the age of the environment means not conservation but development of natural resources, back to the Roosevelt.
Right.
That was my impression of it. I remember Nixon got Aspinall's name wrong in the Rose Garden ceremony. That was not good. I should.
That just brought to mind, I go back to the Clean Air Act. When Nixon signed the Clean Air Act, he did not invite Edmund Muskie, who was an advocate of that legislation, and Muskie was fuming about that. Do you recall any considerations or anything about that?
Yes, I remember that. I thought that was a mistake and recommended that Muskie be.
So it was an intentional snub?
Yes, I think so. Bill Timmons recommended it, and Bill was head of congressional relations at the time.
What was your opinion of Rogers Morton? Would you characterize his tenure, how would you characterize his tenure at Interior, and why do you think he was selected as Hickle's replacement?
Well, I think he was selected as Hickle's replacement because he was he'd been a strong supporter of Nixon. He had a good environmental record. He had been a congressman on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and had proposed the Assateague Island. He was the original proposer of the Assateague Island Natural Park down there. So he had good environmental credentials, and I think that's why Nixon recommended him. Rod had a good political compass. I worked under him. He was my boss over there. And he had a good political compass. He understood the department very much as preservation biologists, fish and wildlife on one side, and miners and geological survey and developers on the other side, and you have to walk the line between them, and he did a good job that way. And he was a good cabinet officer. I think he did a good job.
Did you have
Died young.
any relations or your any connections to the RARE program in the Forest Service and attempt to identify primitive areas according to the Wilderness Act?
Oh yeah, we had a whole task force because the Johnson legislation stipulated that over X number of years, after I can't remember how many, that the Department of Agriculture and Interior were to jointly recommend what were the 5,000 roadless acre areas of the country that should be designated wilderness areas. So we had a whole task force cranking those out. And we cranked them out and we got them all to Congress, which is our job. Now Congress didn't pass but a small percentage of those but at the time because they had other political constituencies in those mining, agriculture and stuff right in the middle of these wilderness areas. But we did our job, the administration, because we had to under the law to get these. And so we had many meeting and many a shootout over these areas, including the whole Alaska, which is the biggest land use decision the country's ever had, where it took 3/4 of the country and put it into parks and things like that. 3/4 of the state, excuse me.
Why specifically did you resign and take the position as Undersecretary of Interior?
Well, I was told to get out of the White House. All of us were. Nixon had a plan. He wanted his loyal people that he trusted to go out and go out in the agencies and get things done out there because they know how he thought and keep it that way. Bud Krogh went out. I went out. Frank Carlucci went out. A whole bunch of us went out and became undersecretaries. We were basically told at the end of the administration, don't you? I think you probably heard about the famous meeting. We're all sitting there in a staff meeting, and Haldeman comes in and says, "You're all fired." This is a couple of days after the election. Well, thanks a lot, you know. So, but that's what was behind that. They used
And
to call us exhausted volcanoes. It's time for a change.
what were specifically your responsibilities at Interior?
Well, when you're undersecretary, you're responsible for the whole place, reporting to the. In any cabinet, the cabinet officer is. I don't mean to diminish the meaning of it, but he's the front man. He's constantly making speeches. He's constantly testifying before Congress, and you're sitting there behind, banging out the policy and working and kind of running the place, and that's true of any undersecretary.
What do you recall of the whole issue of raising grazing fees on public lands?
Well, we talked a lot about it. We're always going to do it. We wanted to do it. It's outrageously low. But the farmer lobby, the cattle range, I don't, to my knowledge, I'm not sure, but I don't think it has been raised in years. It's a certain fee per animal unit month or something like that. But you politically, it's like making water run uphill to get it changed. The constituency is so strong out there.
The mining law of 1872 is still in place. And was there any? Do you recall any effort to reform that or?
Oh yeah, we
that?
had between the pendulum swinging from the environmental revolution to the energy thing, back and forth, things changed. But we had we had new oil, new gas, new geothermal, oil shale. We did environmental impact statements on all those. We changed them. We made the royalties higher. We increased the environmental standards for all of these. Those kind of, if that's the answer to your question, I'm not sure I'm answering it.
No, that's. Did you have sense any frustration on any of this working at Interior with EIS filings?
Yes, they took an awful long time to do, and I had a frustration with that, but we had to do it, and things are better because of it. Now, for example, we went through, I mentioned geothermal steam and oil shale. Neither one of those have come to fruition yet as practical uses of energy, but at least the environmental impact studies have been done. To this day, I have great reservations about oil shale because you just gotta end up dumping a lot of that stuff in the canyons, you know, to get the oil shale out. There is a more promising in-situ method where you cook the stuff right on site, but it has never been developed full time.
Do you believe the environmentalists in filing EISs were really just trying to throw a wrench into the system to buy time to gin up public opposition?
No, I think that's a little too cynical view of it. I think the environmental impact statement was a good, in the end, a good process. And it's funny, the people who in the government learned how to do it best. I used to lecture my guys in the Bureau of Reclamation. I said, the Corps of Engineers, they're the bad guys. They're digging up the earth and everybody's mad at the Corps of Engineers, but they know how to do an EIS that is judicially bulletproof. So when they get sued, and we should learn from them, and I sent our guys over there to learn from the Corps how to do it. Because we were building dams, which are also a no-no with the environmentalists, and we had to do it legally, and we faltered on that to begin with, and we finally learned how to do it well. and it was very important when the energy crisis came along. We were, well, I think we were, is proper though, strong proponents of developing the outer continental shelf, in spite of what had happened at Santa Barbara. And we had very tight regulations, and we did very thorough NEPAs, environmental impact statements. And still, to this day, the whole Atlantic coast has only had a few wells drilled on it.
Right.
All the way from Boston to Savannah, there's only been a couple of wells drilled in that whole Atlantic shelf area. And the eastern Gulf over toward Florida has still not been developed. So, and I don't think we're going to get out of the energy, we're going to drill our way out of the energy crisis, but I'm in favor of exploiting for this oil to buy as much time as we can so we can come up with other technologies to solve this problem.
Obviously, you work closely with Secretary Morton. Did he have a staff meeting every day, or how did he operate his office?
No, he didn't. I did. I had a meeting every morning at 7:30. I had a meeting. And and Roger's main assistant and his political ally, I made sure he was in the meeting so that that way he could go back to Roger and tell him what had happened in the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anything, and Roger was very good to work with. Unfortunately, he got cancer, and a lot of the time I was at the Interior, he was in a hospital out in California. But even then, I would talk to Roger on the phone every couple of days, and once in a while he'd disagree with me and say, no, we're not going to do that, we're going to do it this way, you know. But generally, we had a very good relationship.
Was NWAR an issue up in Alaska at this period? So,
I don't remember it being that much of an issue that early. Certainly it became, building the whole pipeline was an issue. But I don't think ANWR was. The Arctic National Wildlife Range was there, but we hadn't gotten to the point. We were so preoccupied with getting the oil out of Prudhoe Bay, we really hadn't gotten around to what else was going on in Alaska.
The Carter administration signed with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which
Yes, well,
then led to more litigation. But
yeah, that's right. We had a Native Claims Act in our time too, though. Well, that's when we got the.
What would you characterize as your most difficult task at Interior?
I guess the pipeline was the biggest thing. I mean, it was high on everybody's list of getting done, and there was a lot of. Not only did I have problems with it, as I've described, between the two sides of the department, one preservation-oriented, the other development-oriented, but I had huge troubles with the oil companies. Golly, this one guy from, I won't mention the oil company, president of the oil company, I made us move the pipeline over about 500 yards so it wouldn't get around this peregrine falcon's nest. He was down, he was ready to kill me. He was in the office storming around. Probably cost $500,000 to move the pipeline.
The administration proposed double-hulled tankers.
Yeah, late. We should have done it earlier, I think.
Do you think that adequate precautions were made on the sea leg of the from the Prudhoe Bay? I mean, from Valdez on down to the.
You always get that rock. We all knew it was there. We just didn't count on a drunk sea captain.
Right.
So anyway. We really felt that was a good route. It was certainly better than the Canadian route that I've described, that had huge environmental problems.
Richard Fairbanks was selected to replace you at the White House.
Right.
What role, if any, did you play in his selection, and how and why was he selected?
Dick worked for, first time, he came on my radar screen because he was on Ruckelshouse's staff over at EPA. And he was one of the few people over there who was working at or trying to pull economists together to get cost-benefit analysis done of regulations that we were proposing. We had gotten ourselves into a world where I described we have a regulation where there may be 20 of us sitting around the table, Department of Commerce and EPA, and of course EPA wanting a stronger one than Commerce did, and none of us having any real knowledge about the cost implications of these regulations. I mean, we had an instinct, the tighter they are, the more they are, but how much more, and how does it go through the country? And Dick worked in this area. He was very good at it. He caught my attention, so and Chris DeMuth left to go, he got married and went off somewhere, I can't remember, so I needed a new assistant, and I hired Dick, and with Ruckelshouse's it's okay, and he went on to quite a career. He was Assistant Secretary of State He was even at one time the Middle East negotiator. He'll still tell you that Arafat was the darndest Arab rug dealer he ever dealt with.
So that there really wasn't much need to debrief him because he was up to date on everything.
Oh, sure. By the time, well, no, he wasn't when he first came over there, but
Right.
I've forgotten how long he was there before I left, but it must have been 6 months or a year anyway. I think we went through one energy cycle message together, but by then there was a CEQ.
Right.
So we didn't have the major work we had to do. It was more done.
Did you give him any parting words of wisdom?
No, not particularly. I worked with him very closely when this super cabinet came along, and there was several meetings then when Dick was kind of the staff person for Earl Butz on the super cabinet over in the White House.
When Ruckelshaus left EPA, Train requested to move from the Council of Environmental Quality, CEQ, to EPA. Do you believe the White House was de-emphasizing CEQ, and why?
No, I think in this sense that it was becoming clear that EPA was now the enforcer, and that's where the action was. And a lot of the policy work had already been done and was present in the environmental messages that had already gone to Congress from the president. So, and he was just a logical person to replace Bill Ruckelshaus. Let's see, Bill went to the FBI and then got in the Watergate thing and all that.
Saturday Night Massacre and all that.
Right.
In
So
general,
it's de-emphasized in the sense that EPA was now in existence and up and running. It wasn't
Right.
just an idea, and it had enforcement, and they were suing people.
from policy formation to an implementation of policy.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. In general terms, before we get into specifics, how would you characterize the impact of the energy crisis on your job and on the functions of the Department of Interior?
Well, it was quite a swing of the pendulum. I mean, this was really some energy crisis. There were times, I remember talking to Bill Simon, where I'm making these numbers up, but I think they're roughly correct, that the 3 months from the date we're talking, the oil supply of the United States was virtually still at sea, coming from Indonesia or coming from Arabia, and I mean, this country was in real trouble if Henry hadn't gotten this solved. Of course, you remember this started because Nixon backed Golda Meir and sent armament in the 1973 war, and then the Arabs were unhappy with that and cut us off. And I remember dealing with Zaki Yamani, who was the Arab petroleum minister. He was a very talented, NYU educated man, New York University. And I remember Ranj and I sitting with him one day, and we said, Zaki, I said, this country's got all kinds of power and something like that, and you know, if you keep doing this, we're going to go nuclear. And Zaki said, never happened, but you're an environmentalist. He knew exactly what was going on politically, and he knew I was bluffing. And anyway, how it affected the department, excuse me.
Had the White House authorized you to be that blunt with him?
No, I just was. I don't remember. See, a lot of the energy functions of the country, there was no Department of Energy at that time. So the energy, we had coal and gas leasing, offshore oil. It was a logical place for Zaki Yamani to come to talk with Raj Morton. But I don't remember. I just said it, and Raj said it too. It wasn't like we were just trying to. We knew we were in trouble, but Zaki knew we were in trouble too. As to the department, we just stepped up. Getting our revising our coal leasing, oil and gas, mineral, and outer continental, and expanding the outer continental shelf drilling we could do. But all of those had to be done with the legal constraints of NEPA. And we had to, and it didn't do a lot of good to rush through these things and mess up whether your NEPA was legally enforceable or not, or you'd lose it in court, which we had a habit of doing in the early parts of the game when we weren't doing a good job at it.
You mentioned Simon. Nixon created several energy offices.
Yeah.
How was the power, as it were, distributed between the Department of Interior? Was there friction between the energy offices, each one subsequently to the Department of Interior. How was policy formulated in that respect?
Well, there was a lot of liaison between Simon's new shop. We had several. This got to be alphabet soup. We had
Right.
first the Governor Love was kind of in the
Right.
White House, and that didn't work out as
Right.
an energy czar. And then I guess Bill came along as an energy czar, but we had a limited federal energy office or whatever you call it. We had whatever the pieces you could pull together, which didn't require action by Congress.
Right.
We did, and that's what Bill ran.
Right.
And that liaisoned a lot with Roger Morton, because a lot of these things were still over at Interior. They never did leave Interior. Even now with the Department of Energy, these coal leasing and things are still Interior because they're so tied in with the Bureau of Land Management on the public lands, which was an Interior thing.
Was this a mutual discussion, or were orders coming down?
I don't remember any friction really, big time at all.
So it wasn't
I think
Simon issuing a fiat to Morton?
No, I don't think so. I don't recall anything like that. Simon definitely took over the public relations of it. He was on the talk shows and doing he was the energy czar, the spokesman for the administration, not Raj. Which didn't stop Raj from talking. Can't stop Raj from talking. He's a great talker. But Bill was actually the spokesman. But as to friction, no, I don't think.
No resentment on Morton's part that
I don't recall.
this sort of
no.
in my turf type of thing.
No, I really don't call it that way.
Do you remember?
It could have been, but I don't remember it.
Do you recall any meetings with President Nixon about the energy crisis?
Specific things like meeting with I met several times with Morton there and talking about it a lot of times with Morton. I mean, maybe 10 meetings with him, but I didn't with Simon because I was Morton's undersecretary and I'd come to those meetings. But when I was in the White House, the energy crisis hadn't happened, so there was nothing going on then. But I was involved. Yes, wait a minute. I helped do put together an energy message when I was still in the White House. I'd forgotten that. But this was before the Arab embargo. The first energy message dealt with things like oil shale and more development of the continental shelf. It wasn't. It was a much more low-profile thing but it was the first energy message of any president of the United States. So the subject had started to get some teeth.
There was a lot of worrying about the potential for an energy shortage even before the Arab oil
That's
embargo.
right, but nobody had dreamed the Arab embargo was going to happen.
Sort of
at that
precipitated it quickly.
Yeah.
Whose idea was this first message? Where did it come from?
Well, the first I remember about it was Ehrlichman telling me to get on it. So it didn't come from me. I don't know. Herb Stein invented the expression energy independence, which is still controversial in the present day. That was Herb's contribution. Herb was a great guy, by the way. I'm reminiscing now, but he was Can I tell a story about Herb Stein? It's out of context completely. Herb was head of the Council of Environmental Quality, or he was a member of the Council of Environmental Quality. And we used to have these meetings at 7:30 in the morning, and for some reason Herb had to get an answer out of the president about something to do with economics. And he couldn't get an appointment, he couldn't get it done, so Haldeman, he finally gets on, Nixon's going all the way up to Anchorage to welcome Emperor Hirohito, who was doing a fuel stop between Japan and Europe. It was very Nixonian that he would go all the way out of the way to do this. So Herb gets on the plane so that he could fly up there and get this answer. He gets all the way up there, Hirohito and Nixon do their thing and all that. He's on the plane coming back, and it flaps down into Andrews, and he still hasn't got an answer. And he finally gets to Nixon, and while they're still taxiing down there, he gets the answer. Of course, we knew none of this. We're all sitting in the 7:30 meeting, and Herb comes in, very blurry-eyed and tired looking, And I say, Herb, how was Anchorage? He said it was the start. He says, the first time an emperor of Japan has ever had a chance to meet a member of the Council of Environmental Quality. He was a funny guy, a wonderful, whimsical guy.
Did the Department of the Interior have any position on nuclear energy?
No.
How was
We-
nuclear
That was,
energy?
that was Glenn Seaborg's problem over at the AEC. I mean, we saw nuclear energy, but we hadn't put it apart, we hadn't understood that all this had to come together yet, as it later did.
Is part of Project Independence, Nixon proposed a lot of what you had said or you already did, the department was already doing, but included were proposals for a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit
Yes.
and some other conservation
Yeah.
efforts. Do you believe that conservation played a large role in the administration's response to the energy crisis, or could it have played a larger role?
Could have played a larger role if we got unshirted hell for the 55-mile speed limit. All the western states really got after us. The eastern states understood it, but if you lived in Montana, you didn't understand 55 miles an hour. And that's all I remember about it, but I think where we really missed the boat, and is still being missed, is we haven't done nearly enough with electrical conservation. I'm not talking just about turning out the lights. I'm talking about all the machinery we use and things and how they could be designed, admittedly at higher
Efficiency,
cost.
right.
No free lunch, but I think we're going to have to go through that phase sometime.
Now, you're at Interior, so
But we never touched that, really.
I know you're Interior, so you weren't in the White House at this point, but were you aware of any efforts, proposals to weaken NEPA's requirements, the EIS?
Oh, I remember lawyers grumbling about it, but there was no way we were going to. You mean actually go to Congress and change the
Legislative,
proposal
during the
in
energy
law?
crisis, to legislatively
Oh, we did.
propose legislation
It
to
was
weaken
for the
NEPA.
Alaska pipeline.
Right,
There was a specific thing that said NEPA, because we'd
Would
have
not
never
have-
gotten a NEPA done for that thing
right,
politically.
right,
Yeah, and it passed Congress.
right.
Yeah, well, yeah, without that, we were dead in the water.
Which,
I don't remember it for
which
other
precipitated some discussion in the White House for a legislative redress on other NEPA requirements for energy related. Again, you're at Interior.
I don't remember anything other than the one we just spoke about. It could have over in the White House, but it was just wishful thinking. I don't think we ever did it or tried to. I'm not aware it was proposed, was it?
It was discussed. It wasn't proposed.
Okay.
How would you characterize Nixon's budgets for the Department of Interior?
Well, it was the same thing. I was the one always doing it, like I became like any other bureaucrat. I was always trying to get more money, and particularly I was trying to get more money for the Park Service. And I was never able to get him over $300 million a year, which was quite generous and pretty much a high watermark, as I recall, on how much they give to parks a year. Because we had a backlog of almost $2 billion. Congress loved to authorize parks and go home and tell their folks they'd authorize them, but they hadn't appropriated the money for them. So in my time, there was almost $2 billion, I think, of parks authorized and unappropriated.
The Property Review Board, was that still operating at this point?
Oh yeah, that had a strange genesis. Hickel, Wally was always full of ideas, and he wanted to kind of have a mortgage system where his argument was, well, one generation shouldn't have to pay for all the parks, so we buy parks on credit. Well, of course, the council and the budget people would say all that does is increase the liability, the federal liability the government has. And that argument went back and forth, but Nixon was attracted to it. He was attracted to sort of, how can we get a new way to finance parks? We also looked trying to find a new way to finance water pollution plants. So comes the State of the Union, and we still haven't described it, haven't figured out how to do this, but this controversy is going on about how to finance parks. Nixon comes out of his mouth, and it certainly wasn't in the last draft of the State of the Union that I saw, something like, we have a new and inventive way to finance parks. I'm looking around at Ehrlichman, and he's looking at me, you know. Well, that's how the Property Review Board got invented. We were really in trouble to do something, so we decided to make the department shed their land, and it was amazing. It would work so easy. I'd do memos to Mel. I'd do a memo to Mel there. It was always the Department of Defense, and you get a memo from the president of Mel there that says we'd like X place made into a park. You get a memo about that thick back from him saying why it shouldn't be a park. It's been done by And then I'd write another one for the president. He'd write it and say, do it anyway. And it was almost comical, but we got thousands and thousands of acres of land that way. And it was a brilliant, simple idea.
But so the president extemporaneous, he gave an extemporaneous.
As far as I know, I think he thought we had decided this thing, and I'm not sure that I saw the last draft. The last draft I saw did not have the park in it. Did not have anything about a new and a exciting way to finance parks, and yet it came right out of his mouth the next morning. See, I saw the last draft maybe 4 in the afternoon, and this speech wasn't until the next, not that night, but the next night. So it may have got put in there somehow, but Ehrlichman didn't know about it, and I didn't know about it, and we sure should. And I don't remember asking Ray Price, the speechwriter, how it got there. But we didn't have any.
Which State of the Union was this?
I think 70. I don't know. I can't remember.
Can't recall.
It's right in the State of the Union there,
Right.
down there in Congress.
But this had been an issue that was important to Nixon, to the president.
Yeah, he got involved in this and was kind of attracted by Wally Hickle's idea about this. And then I guess he was aware of the fight going on between the budget people and the environmentalists about whether we should do this within the White House going on.
There seems to be some suggestions in the papers that what attracted Nixon to this proposal was the idea that the Property Review Board would identify urban parks. And it's been suggested that Nixon saw environmentalists as rather elitist. And the parks was an area where it would affect the common person in the city. There'd be some green space and would be a physical legacy that would be associated with him. After the Property Review Board was up and running, it was criticized from environmentalists for not appointing more environmentally critical areas.
Right.
And Nixon was, in the papers anyway, well, you're never going to please them because, to him, a park was something that was to be used for the common person. Those elitist environmentalists want to set land aside. Is that all a fair assumption?
Very fair. It was very much in his gut. I think I mentioned he would talk about how when he was a kid in Port Yorba Linda, nobody had the money to go to Yellowstone, and we got to get parks nearer to people and all that. And he didn't mind if it was, he could take some old Defense Department war base that had old bombs and mines sitting around and clean them up and make a park out of it, or a little postage stamp thing. He was more, it was very much, as you said, that he, and there was resistance to this even in the National Park Service. I remember talking to the graduating class at the Ranger School down in Grand Canyon. And boy, the questions were, what are you doing with all these little dirty little urban parks that aren't environmentally clean, and they go to make their Yellowstone speech,
Right.
And I'd say, well, this president doesn't feel that way. But so it was the Leather Britches Society and the Park Service was even resisting it.
Right. When all this is going on, Watergate is taking place.
Right.
Did that in any way affect your job or the department's operation?
Well, I was over at Interior. It gave me some relief from being away from this awful tragedy that was going on. But I don't recall that it hurt our ability to get legislation through. But I think, I don't know. We did pretty well because with the things we were getting through Congress with these new leasing requirements and things like that. And a lot of that was regulatory. We didn't have to go to the Hill, but some of it we had to go to the Hill for. And it moved along pretty well. And a lot of people would say, well, it'd be better if Watergate wasn't going on, but I don't know. But that's just one department. It certainly paralyzed and slowed the government down to a stop eventually. Like the super cabinet kind of just fell apart there at the last moment.
Any examples of that slowing the process down from your standpoint?
No, not from Interior. That's what I can't remember. But I have a feeling, well, the super cabinet was one. I had the feeling that it got to the point where the administration, what the president proposed to Congress wasn't taken seriously. He wasn't going to be there that long.
Right.
Kind of that kind of.
Was there any impact on morale?
Well, there sure was on mine. God, it was like losing Watergate to me was like losing an older brother or a father,
How did you hear the news of his resignation?
I got it from Raj. I was up in Harper's Ferry doing something with the Park Service up in Harper's Ferry, and I got this phone call in the car, and Roger had just come out of a cabinet meeting and said the president's going to resign tonight.
And you were in the East Room when Nixon.
Well, that was the
met
next
with-
morning. I
met
was in
with
the East
next
Room when he
morning.
did that goodbye speech. Yeah, that was.
Can you recall, can you tell us what it was like for you?
You mean that?
Yeah. It was,
Oh God, it was painful. It was so sad. Just I never forget him putting on his glasses. I never saw him, even privately in the Oval Office, with glasses on before. He had these glasses on, reading it, and it was quite a speech. And people were just sobbing, and even the press was feeling sorry for him. Seemed like some of them were. Anyway, I remember Herb Kaplow was. I remember Herb real well as ABC reporter. I was standing near him. And then we all went out in the, back of where the helicopter was, and I remember I was standing there with Rose Woods, and we were crying. And seeing that chopper go off around the monument and out to Andrews was pretty tough. And then we all went upstairs and had a reception with President Ford about an hour later. And then we all went back to work.
How did President Ford's assumption of power affect your jobs?
It didn't at all. He'd probably want to get his own undersecretary in there somewhere at point, but that was Nixon resigned in August. Well, why I left Interior is I had a heart attack. So I said, enough of this, and I got out. Incidentally, that's an interesting story to give you a sense of Nixon's kindness. He was quite kind that way. Here was this poor guy out at San Clemente, you know. He was disgraced and out of office, and somehow got the word I was going to have a heart attack, and he called me in the hospital. And here was the conversation. He says, "Who's cutting?" Just like that. And I said, "Well, sir, his name is Jose Garcia. He's never heard of him. I said, "Well, I think he's pretty good." I said, he's just come from Cleveland where he did a bypass on Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia." There's this silence on the phone. He says, "You'll be all right, John. The Arabs always buy the best." Click, the phone goes down. So, and he was that way. I tell that story because anybody on Nixon's staff can tell you a story about how they walk in the office and he'll tell you about how I understand your child's sick and talk about them and know their name, and it was incredible the way it was that way. And he didn't have that public image at all.
Everybody commented that I've spoken with, Nixon's innate intelligence, his ability on specifics was just amazing. He would come back to, you'd have a conversation with him and think that it was in passing, and you'd see him a month and a half later, and he would say, "You know, I was thinking about our conversation last time," and would pick up on it. Is that what you mentioned that about
Well, there's no
Nixon?
question. He was brilliant. He was. Remember, I mentioned earlier that he decided what it was he wanted to decide and tried to get the rest of it pushed away from him.
Right.
That's why I became an undersecretary, and that's why we had the super cabinet and all that. He was incredibly, and on those issues that he cared about, my golly, he was really into it. Like he'd say, "Don't give me a cabin officer over here. You don't know anything about this. Give me a GS-14 and knows what he's talking about." And you bring a GS-14 in the office, he's never seen a president of the United States in his life. And some of them was just dissolved and not up to the task. And other ones could really tell Nixon something that no one else had been able to tell him. And he could
you
do
remember
that.
a couple of issues where that happened?
No, because that only happened to me once or twice. I can't remember what the issue was. Oh, yeah, it had to do with he got enamored with this issue about recycling cars. The idea was when you buy a car, you pay an extra $50 for it. Then the next person who owns a car keeps that $50, and that $50 is still there when it's an old car, and that $50 is what is paid to take the car back to get it junked, so it could be recycled. So, and we all kind of. So anyway, there was this expert a guy over in the Bureau of Mines. I can't remember his name, and he came in. I got him in to see the president. He's a professor now, but I don't know, he still is at Penn State. And he basically told him it wasn't going to work unless he put a tax to, and they used the word tax.
Yeah.
That's $200 or $300 on the thing. And even then, Nixon, you could see Nixon blink, like it wasn't going to be his kind of thing. But we even wrote into the message, because we didn't know where he was going to come out on that we were going to study the issue. But the truth is, we never studied, and that was the end of it.
But it was his idea?
But it was his idea, yeah. But it wasn't his idea. But he liked the idea. When he was going through the things that he would get periodic memos from us updating him on where we were on this message, which Chris DeMuth used to write.
Right.
And this was in there, and you could see the checks beside it. And then I remember talking to him one time about it, and he liked the idea of doing something about it.
This is an environmental message.
Yeah, it was just like it was part of the environmental message, just the same theory as recycling a Coke bottle back by paying an extra nickel for it.
Right. Nixon, after his resignation, was in San Clemente, and you visited him. I forget whether you told me this or whether another interviewee told me this, but according to what was told me anyway, and I sort of conclude the book with this, you had commented that the environment was going to be something he'd be remembered for. And he had reportedly responded, God, John, I hope not. Or something to the effect with, if that's what I'm remembered for, then I'm in trouble. Do you recall that conversation at all?
No, I never had it. Closest conversation I ever had that sounds like that, which is second, wasn't with him, but John Ehrlichman told me about it. They were flying back from Chicago, where he had dedicated a sewage treatment plant, where that was part of stuff we did out there after the environmental message. And he said something like, all I'm going to be remembered for is sewage treatment plants. All these plants all over the country are going to be called the Richard Nixon Sewage Treatment Plant. That's all I remember I don't remember the comment you made.
What do you consider your greatest accomplishment at the White House Art Interior?
Oh, God. Just having the privilege of dealing with all this environment issue. I don't know if it was an accomplishment. I guess it was an accomplishment that the history turned out well. I mean, when you speak of Nixon now and they talk about his domestic achievements, EPA is always on the list, and I hope I'm not being biased when I think he's probably the greatest environmental president, certainly since Teddy Roosevelt, as far as what he actually accomplished.
Do you think that
Nixon was there at
Nixon's,
the right time to do that? But
do you think Nixon's received historically the credit he deserves for the environment?
I think he is starting to. Yeah, I even find real rabid environmentalists who'll say Nixon did a good job in the environment. They don't like anything else about him, but they think he did a good job in the environment. You know.
I tell my students that history is written from the perspective of the present day. The environment today is very much almost a partisan wedge issue. If you say, I'm an environmentalist today, too often people will assume that you are a Democrat.
Correct.
Or if you are, in Rush Limbaugh speaking of environmental Nazis or whatever, environmental wackos.
Right.
It has been suggested that the Nixon administration was the end of the bipartisan era of the environment. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
The end. You mean it was bipartisan before Nixon?
It was bipartisan
Yeah.
up to the Nixon administration, and after Nixon, we begin to see more partisanship on the environment, culminating today with the way it's perceived as a wedge issue.
That could be. If it is, I think it's probably still like almost everything was in that era, a byproduct of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War got mixed up with everything. And I think it's true what you say, a Rush Limbaugh thing. It would be an environmental wacko and a greenie Democrat who will never be correct. I think that's true, but I'm not sure I'm not sure it wasn't true before. I think it just happened to get more polarized by the
But under
Vietnam
the Reagan,
War.
in the Reagan era, Republicans no longer embraced environmentalism for the most part. Or at
That's
least the
right.
party did.
That's right. That's right.
So what happened?
Well, the environment kept going on and getting better, and the regulations tighter, and in spite of the rhetoric. But
the party, I think Brooks' point is
yeah.
that it it actually, a wedge issue, or it actually defines the difference between the parties. Whereas Republicans and Democrats were both environmentalists in the period that
Yeah.
you were.
Well, I don't know, there's still plenty of Republicans that are environmentalists. Maybe not as many as Democrats, but there's plenty of them.
What's been suggested that having teaching graduate classes in environmental history, what the general overview is that environmentalism was a product of an affluent society, post-World War II affluent. And when you get to the 70s,
Right.
beginning with the energy crisis and the stagflation and you know, all of that going on, it became apparent that there were limits. And,
Yes.
And with the limits now becoming apparent to the public, the environment was an issue seen as too great a cost. It was elitist,
I
and
think it-
and so the business had begun to react. You mentioned earlier the comment about the business reaction. You begin to see an organized business lobby, and so when Reagan comes in, Reagan assumes that environment doesn't have that deep roots, and he challenges it directly, but finds that environmental groups rise, and
Right.
you know, Ann Gorsuch and James Watt at Interior, and then Nixon begins to back off from it, and he brings
Reagan begins to back
Reagan,
off.
excuse me, Reagan
That's
brings
right.
it,
He left Watt
William
and Gorsh out there hanging
and
on a limb.
Ruckelshaus comes back into EPA.
That's right.
And so today we have a president. This is my opinion. So, but both parties adhere to the rhetoric of environmentalism: clear skies, healthy forest. But in actuality, there is a lot more partisanship on the issue. Now, there are certainly exceptions both ways, but the environmentalists use it as a way to gin up financial contributions, as do the other side. And both sides use the partisanship. You know, that when Reagan was in office, contributions to environmental groups skyrocketed, membership shot up. And Reagan was good for the environmental organizations, if not, you know, good for the environment. But and so that there's politics and money playing in here.
Right.
And do you think that's all? That's how
No, I
does
think that's
reaction to that?
all pretty rational and the way it is. What made me stop when your earlier question was, did the partisanship start with Nixon and wasn't there with Johnson? All I can remember, those businessmen were mighty angry when I used to talk to them, right in the first days of that thing. So, witness the comment about how would Dick have communists like you on his staff? So,
Before we end, there are a couple of different questions we'd like to ask. Go ahead.
Oh, if we have a few more minutes. We touched on briefly earlier about your responsibilities in the White House as Secretary to the Cabinet.
Right.
And we're going back again in time, about
Okay.
the first five months or so of the administration. What were your responsibilities in terms of working with the Cabinet and sub-Cabinet? And furthermore, how did your work reflect Nixon's own thoughts on governance?
well, I used to call them the 12 Apostles, and see, there was no domestic council. But I don't know. I can't imagine how a White House operated without a domestic council before our time. But it didn't have one when it started, and I would get calls that had to do with rather esoteric issues, and no one in the White House, there was no institution in the White House to answer them. I'd get calls, high-level intellectual calls like that, and I'd get calls from people like Martha Mitchell about where do I go to a hairdresser and should we have a press conference. So you never knew kind of what. So the institution, without a domestic council, made it very difficult. But my responsibility was to do what I could about that. Now, for example, most of the issues I'd refer to OMB, or they were press calls, which I'd refer to Herb Klein. More Herb than the Ziegler, because Ziegler was in the day-by-day press briefing, and Herb was longer range. But it was very disorganized. Then on top of that, my duty was, of course, when we had cabinet meetings, to suggest an agenda to Nixon and who should speak and what should be said and all that. But they, as the expression goes, they often turn into dog and pony shows where one cabinet officer would be briefing a group of other cabinet officers on an issue about which they had absolutely nothing to do with and cared less about, probably. So as I said, if it wasn't budget or it wasn't politics, there wasn't much for the cabinet to talk about. So there was more and more emphasis then on these sub-cabinet committees, which some worked better than others, but had the same kind of limitations. So the whole cabinet experience for me was not one where I saw government really, wasn't really where the action was.
But did you get the, you were watching as President Nixon was using the White House staff more and more to run the government. I mean, he was cutting cabinet secretaries, most famously William Rogers, out of a lot of what he was doing.
Oh, that's right. That became the famous day when he got up and with John Connally doing the pitch, and sat there and told the cabinet officers that there was a guy named Ehrlich and there was a domestic council and they were going to do this and that, and the cabinet was immediately threatened and alienated by that whole concept. But Nixon did it, and I think it is true that our domestic council in the end had a lot more power in policy making, because in the cabinet so many issues cross-cut one department to another. Like EPA is an example of that. How we created how to pull all these pieces together, so that the power that accrued to Ehrlichman was not just he had a comfortable relationship with the president, but the intellectual, organizational sense of it made sense. And every president since has had a domestic council of some type, and cabinet government is not certainly the robust thing it was in Eisenhower's day, and I think for good reason.
Did Nixon ever comment on his experience? Did he ever talk to you about his experience in the Eisenhower administration and cabinet government in that period?
No, I never did. I remember having a discussion with Brad Patterson. It's in that paper that I wrote, where Brad would talk about that he thought Nixon did very well in cabinet meetings, and that he was quite deferential, spoke when spoken to, but where he was really good was after a discussion had been going on for a long time. He had ability to kind of sum it up and say, well, there's 4 or 5 reasons we do this, there's 3 reasons why we shouldn't do it, kind of summarizing the thing. And he was going, George Shultz came to Nixon's attention for the same reason. I could see that in cabinet meetings. George was very good at being quite quiet and then summarizing what had been said. And that attracted Nixon's attention. That's how George's star started to brighten.
We're running a little low on time, but
Yeah.
I did want to ask about your relations with the Agriculture Department, and specifically your sitting in on that fateful March 1971 meeting with Schultz, Rice, Campbell, Hardin, John Connally, and others concerning the so-called milk money price support decision. What's your recollection of that meeting?
Well, I remember before the meeting happened, there was an issue back and forth as to whether we should raise price supports on milk. And Hardin, well, he came to a decision. I forgot what the decision was. He raised it somewhat. And that set off, the milk lobby was very unhappy with that. Okay, well, so what? That was done as far as I was concerned. Then, next thing, I'm invited into this meeting, which John Connally was the main spokesman, the meeting you just referred to. And the bottom line in that meeting is, well, Congress is going to roll us. They're going to raise the price supports. They've got the power to do that and raise the price supports and keep the milk lobby happy. So if we're going to get rolled anyway, let's go ahead and do it now. So Secretary Hardin, we're going to contradict your decision. Cliff, make a new decision now at a higher rate, and that's what we did. We walked out of the room. As far as I know, there was no implication in that meeting that I heard or ever heard later that we did that in return for political contributions from the milk lobby. But that's what was charged, and that's what Connally was later charged with. That's my knowledge of it.
So
But now, if there was another meeting or something, the meeting I was in, nothing like that happened.
Yeah, I think it was a meeting that followed your meeting.
You mean when I left the
Connally
room, huh?
stayed.
Oh, really?
Yes.
And you
There's some
you
discussion.
think there was a discussion there?
There seems to be
You've
evidence
seen
of
it.
that.
There's a tape there then.
There's a tape where Haldeman's reporting it to Nixon that Conley has talked to the mill people and that the money will be forthcoming. And the timing of the announcement of the price increase in price support, and then shortly, a couple days thereafter, the actual delivery of the money seems to be more than coincidental.
Oh, yes. God, I never heard that before. I didn't know this.
So, do you have any recollections about, again, just tying up a few loose ends here, the U.S.-Soviet grain deal? I understand you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I remember when we started shipping grain to the Soviets had a drought, so they said, and they wanted to buy a lot of grain, and the Secretary of Agriculture was amenable to it. Sounded a good idea to me. Nobody was saying let's not do it, so we did it. First of all, it made a lot more money for the farmers. Second of all, it was able to us to reduce the wheat price support that we had to pay, the federal government had to pay, the taxpayer had to pay. So it went on, but it turned around later, and it was turned against us because the Russians apparently, I don't know if in fact they did, but I think they did, turn around and instead of using some of that wheat, sold it somewhere else at a higher profit. Then there was always the argument that there really wasn't a drought. It got to the point I went over to the CIA one day just to look at the satellite photos. And sure enough, the people who were expert on this stuff could point out all these brown areas we were looking at in Russia. And yes, indeed, there really is a drought. So that's my recollection of it. But we took a lot of heat for that, but I think we probably did the right thing.
You know, another one you want to ask about, did you play a role in Earl Butts' confirmation as agriculturist?
You have a good Glenn Garment quote, apparently.
Hardin came in, and I was with him to see the president. Says, "I want to resign. I have to spend enough time in public office. I want to leave." So the next thing, Nixon gets Bryce Harlow, Fred Malek, who was our personnel man, and myself, go find me another Secretary of Agriculture quickly. So we had these interviews over at the local metropolitan club. We'd invite these possible candidates in, and they had no idea they were being interviewed to be Secretary of Agriculture. The pitch was, we want you to, what do you think of our agricultural policy? If you got any thoughts on how to change it, send us a paper on that, da-da-da-da-da. So the three of us, Malek, myself, and Harlow, unanimously recommended Earl Butts. And in goes the memo to Earl Butts, and a couple of days later, I'm flying along on Air Force One, and I get from Haldeman to come up front, and Nixon says, I don't want Butts. He says, Butts was assistant secretary under Ezra Benson in the Eisenhower cabinet, and the farmers were very unpopular with him, and that's going to rush off on him again. He probably won't get confirmed. Not going to do it. So I go back, and I guess I said, we'll go for another guy, yes, sir. And I went back and I told this to Garment, it was in the back of the plane, and I can remember, he says, well, no ifs, no ands, no buts. Just like that. Well, it turned out a couple of, 2 or 3 weeks went by, and we didn't have a better candidate, and we sent Butts' name in again, and he finally said yes. And Nixon said yes. And then just what Nixon had predicted happened. Everybody started saying, this guy he used to be with Benson in the Eisenhower years. They didn't like him. The head of I got a call at night, went down to a hotel, and there was poor Earl and his wife with Jack Miller, who was the senator, Republican senator, head of the Agricultural Committee, who was going to oppose him. So we figure, he's poor guy's dead. And Earl was good about it. He'd keep calling over to me and say, well, if the president wants me to get out, I'll get out. And I didn't know what was going on. I wasn't that close to the president day by day, but I wasn't about to say, I don't know. I'd just undermine the poor guy's confidence. So I'd say, oh, everything's fine. I really wasn't telling the truth, just to keep his spirits up. And one day, Clark McGregor went out to the helicopter. He was the congressional guy. And said, well, you want him to stay in or not? What do you want to do? And he says, hang in there. So we hung in there, and Butts won. Got 3 or 4 votes. And he was a marvelous Secretary of Agriculture. Did a nice job. Good man.
Why was Bryce Harlow involved in this process?
He was head of congressional relations at the time. Or I don't know if he was head of it, but he was kind of a wise man around the White House who knew if anybody could tell you if somebody was going to get confirmed or not, he'd be about as good as anybody, knowing where the votes were on the Hill.
Why Why was Hickel fired?
I guess so. I guess in pick over that Cambodia leak, the letter that was written. Nixon once, I heard him once say, because they were trying to figure out where to put the NOAA, whether to put it in commerce with Maury Stans or with Wally over there, and he says, well, Hickel's not a good manager. He lets that letter leak. But I think he was really thinking about the letter, not the manager concept.
What was your reaction when you heard that Nixon had been taping in the White House?
Well, I was just shocked. I guess I had a more personal reaction, is because I had been cabinet secretary and Butterfield replaced me, so I might well have been the person who would have had knowledge of that system. But even then, when I was shocked, what really shocked me was that some of the language on there, because he didn't swear a little bit, just like a lot of people, but nothing like you'd see on those tapes. And well, it's just downhill from there.
Could you tell us something about Charles Colson? Did you ever interact with him?
Oh, sure, yeah. Chuck was a nice guy. He was a smart guy. If he had a shortcoming, it was that he got a lot of power early and didn't really know the president as well as some of us knew. So he had a habit of, when Nixon would tell him to do something, he would salute and do it. And even without reflecting on whether it was like a good age should to any president. Reflect on whether, hey, you sure you really want to do this, or let's think about this for a week. He'd have it done in the next 24 hours, and Nixon liked that. He liked it. I finally